Germany, autumn 1943. A cold wind moved across the airfield at Rechlin, stirring fog between hangars painted in camouflage blotches. In the center of the tarmac stood a shape unlike any other, a massive, broad-shouldered fighter painted over with black crosses. Its round cowling and thick wings gave it the look of a brawler. Beneath the canopy, English markings had been hastily covered with fresh paint, a captured American P-47 Thunderbolt. Engineers crowded around the machine, notebooks in gloved hands. One loosened a side panel. Beneath it, a labyrinth of pipes, ducts and turbines glimmered in the cold light. The air smelled of burnt oil and new metal. Someone muttered, "Das ist unmöglich." Moments later, a test pilot climbed the ladder. The radial engine coughed once, twice, then thundered alive with a force that shook dust from the rafters. The sound echoed across the field, deeper than any German fighter. As the great propeller blurred into motion, the Reich's engineers realized they were staring into something they had never built before: raw, relentless American power. By the spring of 1943, the air over Europe had become a laboratory of destruction. Every dawn, the contrails of the 8th Air Force stretched from the English coast toward the smoking industrial heart of the Reich. Silver bombers climbed in vast, geometric columns, B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators carrying thousands of tons of explosives toward Schweinfurt, Regensburg and Bremen. Below them, German radar screens lit up, and fighter groups scrambled from grass and concrete runways across France, Holland and Germany. The outcome of the war's air campaign hung on a single question: who could control the sky above 25,000 feet? The Luftwaffe entered this phase with veterans, discipline, and still formidable machines: the Messerschmitt Bf-109G and Focke-Wulf FW-190A. Yet both designs were near their engineering limits. Their engines depended on complex mechanical superchargers and emergency injection systems that strained under continuous combat. Altitude robbed them of power. Dive speed carried the risk of compressibility. To defend Germany's factories, the Luftwaffe needed both numbers and altitude performance it could no longer guarantee. Across the Channel, the Americans arrived with an entirely different philosophy of air war. Their bombers would fly by day, not night, and rely on armor, defensive guns, and eventually long-range fighter escort. The instrument of that escort was still taking shape in the spring of 1943, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was unlike any fighter the Germans had yet seen. Built around the twin-row Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the Thunderbolt was enormous, over 7 tons loaded. With a wingspan nearly equal to a twin-engine light bomber's, it could absorb punishment that would shred a 109 or 190 and then dive away at nearly 500 miles per hour without shedding a rivet. Its 850 caliber Browning machine guns delivered a hurricane of fire. Early missions showed both its strengths and flaws: unmatched speed in a dive, but limited range. Even with drop tanks, the first Thunderbolts could not accompany bombers beyond Belgium. Still, pilots loved its toughness. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. For German intelligence, every new American machine represented both threat and opportunity. Since the war's beginning, the Luftwaffe had maintained a quiet tradition of studying captured aircraft. The central testing establishment, Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, north of Berlin, served as the nerve center of that effort. There, technical officers dissected enemy designs to extract performance data, flight limits, and maintenance techniques. Parallel to it operated the Versuchsverband Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, later nicknamed Circus Rosarius. Its pilots flew captured Allied planes, marked with German insignia, to demonstrate strengths and weaknesses to frontline units. These efforts produced detailed intelligence sheets circulated to fighter squadrons. Climb curves, turning radii, recommended counter-tactics. To the Luftwaffe, a captured aircraft was not a trophy. It was a teacher. In the summer of 1943, luck and circumstance delivered one of those teachers intact. Somewhere in France, a P-47 was forced down. Accounts differ on whether mechanical failure or combat damage caused it. The pilot was captured. The aircraft, largely undamaged, was dismantled, crated, and sent by rail to Germany. Within weeks, it rolled out onto the apron at Rechlin, freshly painted with yellow recognition bands and black crosses. Engineers from Reichlin's Flugmotoren Prüfstand and BMW's engine division gathered for preliminary inspection. They expected a conventional American radial engine, perhaps oversized but familiar. What they found instead challenged everything they knew about high-altitude power. Beneath the fuselage ran long ducts leading aft to a bulky turbine. Assembly, the General Electric turbo-supercharger, a steam device that used exhaust gases to drive a separate compressor feeding air back to the front-mounted supercharger. The Germans had experimented with such systems in the late 1930s, but abandoned them as too complex and costly. Now they confronted a production fighter built around that very principle and functioning flawlessly. The Thunderbolt embodied an industrial philosophy Germany could scarcely match in 1943. Mass-produced complexity made reliable. Its alloy castings, intercooler cores, and precision valves demanded a materials infrastructure already strained by blockade and bombing. To the engineers, paging through its maintenance manual, the discovery was both admiration and alarm. Here was proof that American industry could field not just quantity, but technical audacity. By autumn, the first test runs confirmed what frontline pilots were already reporting. The P-47 held full power above 25,000 feet, climbed steadily, and could dive faster than any German interceptor without structural failure. A new variable had entered the air war. One Germany's own engineers would now try to measure. The next phase was inevitable. The Thunderbolt would be flown, instrumented, and finally taken apart piece by piece. Every pipe, wire, and bolt would be logged. What those engineers recorded in the weeks that followed would astonish even seasoned veterans of the Reich's aviation industry. The first days of inspection unfolded with quiet disbelief. When technicians removed the long belly panels, they found what one engineer later described in a report as eine Fabrik im Flugzeug, a factory inside an airplane. The Thunderbolt's fuselage was a maze of stainless steel tubing, pressure lines, intercooler radiators, oil coolers, and control rods, all nested with mathematical precision. To men accustomed to the compact simplicity of the Bf-109, it looked extravagant, even reckless. Yet every element served purpose. To keep the R-2800 delivering power at stratospheric altitudes where most German engines gasped for air. At the heart of their fascination lay the General Electric C-23 turbo-supercharger. German aircraft such as the Ju-88P, FW-190A, or Bf-109G relied solely on mechanically driven superchargers, efficient at low level, but increasingly inefficient as altitude rose. The American system diverted exhaust gases through a turbine, spinning a compressor that fed air forward through long ducting to the engine's front stages. Between the two lay intercoolers to cool the compressed air and prevent detonation. It was complex, heavy, and, to German eyes, impossibly wasteful of material. Yet its results were undeniable. A steady 2,000 horsepower at altitudes where the DB-605 struggled to maintain 1,200. Reports circulated between Rechlin, BMW, and Daimler-Benz engineering offices. The consensus was that the design could not be replicated quickly. The Reich lacked both the nickel-chrome alloys and the precision manufacturing of turbine blades that General Electric had perfected years earlier. A similar German experiment, the BMW 801J turbo project, had already been shelved for those very reasons. The Thunderbolt system worked because the Americans could afford to build and service thousands of units. Germany could barely build prototypes. Still, fascination grew. Each subassembly removed revealed another layer of thought. The electrical system used color-coded wiring harnesses. Quick-release cowling fasteners simplified maintenance. The cockpit layout placed instruments in a logical arc around the pilot's eyeline. Even the armored glass windscreen and thick canopy framing testified to priorities. Pilot survival first, production efficiency second. The phrase Überkonstruktion, over-engineering, appeared repeatedly in German notes. But behind that criticism was reluctant respect. The engineers compared it to their own machines. A Fu-90A8 weighed roughly 4.9 tons. The Thunderbolt exceeded 7. Yet the heavier aircraft could dive faster, retain energy longer, and return home riddled with holes that would destroy lighter opponents. German test pilot Hans Ferdinand Rosarius, whose unit Circus Rosarius specialized in flying captured aircraft, described the Jug's stability as astonishing. It was like steering a locomotive, slow to answer, but once committed, nothing could stop it. To pilots trained on the agile but fragile Bf-109, that endurance seemed alien. While mechanical teams disassembled components, Luftwaffe tacticians studied flight data. They concluded that dogfighting a Thunderbolt on equal terms was futile. The American machine could absorb cannon hits, dive away at terminal speed, and climb back once clear. Orders circulated through Jagdgeschwader 26 and JG-2, advising pilots, avoid pursuit in dive, attack from above, disengage early. These technical memoranda, born from the captured aircraft's trials, quietly reshaped frontline tactics through late 1943 and early 1944. Industrial analysts, meanwhile, focused on logistics. The Thunderbolt's reliance on high-octane fuel, 100-130 grade, was noted with envy. German aviation fuel seldom exceeded 96 octane. Shortages forced units to blend substitutes that reduced detonation margins. Without such fuel, the R-2800's performance was impossible to duplicate. It was not just technology that impressed the Reich's engineers. It was the industrial ecosystem behind it. Refineries, metallurgical plants, transport and maintenance depots operating without fear of bombing, at least in 1943. By December, the Rechlin report was complete. It described the P-47 as a technological expression of a wealthy industrial power, too heavy for German production philosophy, yet perfectly suited to America's strategic doctrine of long-range escort and firepower dominance. In a war increasingly defined by attrition, reliability outweighed elegance. The dissection ended, but its echo carried far beyond the hangar walls. The notes traveled to design offices in Bremen, Munich, and Dessau. Within months, Germany's next generation of fighters, the Ta-152H, the Do-335, the Me-262, all placed new emphasis on sustained high-altitude power and structural strength. None would enter service in numbers large enough to matter, yet the lesson had been learned. Engineering alone could not compensate for industrial scale. As the last components of the captured Thunderbolt were crated for storage, one engineer scribbled a final remark in pencil on the cover sheet. Technisch überlegen, aber zu schwer. Technically superior, but too heavy. What he could not know was that within a year, those heavy, over-engineered jugs would be escorting bombers deep into Saxony, erasing the factories that had built his own machines. The teardown was over. The consequences were only beginning. Angle A, the power plant. Inside the hangar, the R-2800 dominated the room. 2 rows of 9 cylinders formed a massive disc of steel and aluminum, each cylinder capped with twin spark plugs, each plug fired by redundant magnetos. The German engineers had studied radial engines before, BMW 801, Brahmo 323, but none matched the Thunderbolt's sheer sophistication. When test run on a bench stand, the engine produced an unbroken wall of noise that rattled tools from tables. At low RPM, it idled smoothly. At full throttle, the entire frame trembled under 2,000 horsepower. What astonished the evaluators was not only the raw output, but its consistency. Hours of operation showed no measurable drop in power, no overheating, no cracked cylinders. The Americans had mastered cooling airflow with a clever cowl flap arrangement and an oil cooling system that maintained temperature within tight limits. The real marvel, however, remained the turbo-supercharger network. German observers noted the twin wastegates controlled automatically by altitude sensors, something the Reich's aircraft lacked. The system balanced boost pressure with such precision that pilots needed only one control lever. Simplicity for the flyer, complexity for the engineer, an inversion of German philosophy. Where the Luftwaffe emphasized pilot skill and mechanical purity, American design placed trust in automation and production uniformity. Every Thunderbolt leaving the line would perform like the last. That predictability struck Rechlin's staff as both alien and enviable. Angle B, the dive and energy tactics. When Circus Rosarius test pilot Theodore Rosarius took the captured P-47 aloft, observers recorded a climb sluggish by German standards, but a dive that bordered on the frightening. At 25,000 feet he rolled inverted, pointed the nose earthward, and advanced throttle. Within seconds, the airframe shrieked through the transonic boundary. Control stiffened but held. At 480 miles per hour indicated, the jug still responded to its elevators, something no FW-190 could safely attempt. Flight data confirmed that compressibility, the invisible wall that had killed many Luftwaffe pilots, arrived later and less violently in the Thunderbolt. Its thick wing and deep fuselage generated stabilizing shock patterns that preserved control authority deeper into the dive. German analysts realized that any attempt to pursue a fleeing P-47 could end in structural failure. The tactical directive followed. Nicht folgen im Sturzflug. Do not follow in a dive. This single lesson reshaped engagements above the Reich. BF-109s and FW-190s began striking from higher altitude and breaking away upward instead of downward. The Thunderbolt's advantage in terminal velocity forced the Luftwaffe to fight within vertical limits it had once dominated. Combat reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 during early 1944 confirmed the change. American fighters diving through flak corridors with impunity, re-emerging unscathed to climb again. German pilots coined a grudging nickname, Der Tauchpanzer, the diving tank. To the engineers studying Rosarius's flight charts, the cause was clear. Strength weighed more than agility. Where German design prized minimal mass for turning radius, the P-47's extra ton of metal served as armor and structural insurance. What looked inefficient on paper saved lives in the air. Angle C, the airframe and survivability. A week later, the Thunderbolt was pushed onto wooden trestles for ballistic tests. Technicians mounted captured MG-151-20 cannons and fired controlled bursts at its wings and fuselage from short range. The results bordered on heresy. Cannon shells that would shred a Bf-109 barely punctured the jug's multi-layer skin. Fuel lines were protected by self-sealing rubber, the cockpit wrapped in a tub of steel plating. Even with hydraulics disabled, the aircraft's manual trim and cable redundancy allowed partial control. The German team documented everything: the armor's thickness, the arrangement of spars, the distribution of mass. They concluded that the aircraft could lose an entire cylinder, a portion of elevator, even a coolant leak, and still return to base. For a Luftwaffe increasingly short of veteran pilots, such survivability represented a strategic luxury beyond reach. At the human level, those reports fed a quiet anxiety among fighter units. Pilots already strained by fuel shortages and Allied numerical superiority now faced an opponent that simply refused to fall. One intelligence memo summarized morale bluntly. Enemy fighters absorb punishment disproportionate to hits achieved. The phrase appeared again in frontline diaries. Every encounter confirmed it. American pilots often brought home aircraft that by German standards should have been written off before reaching the Channel. This resilience stemmed from manufacturing philosophy. American production lines used interchangeable panels and jigs that guaranteed uniform strength. Maintenance depots replaced damaged sections instead of rebuilding airframes. The Luftwaffe, relying on skilled craftsmen, could not match such throughput. For German engineers at Rechlin, the Thunderbolt embodied not only mechanical superiority, but also an industrial culture willing to trade elegance for endurance. By the end of these evaluations, 3 conclusions emerged. First, the Americans had achieved altitude power Germany could not reproduce. Second, the Thunderbolt's dive and structure rewrote the limits of aerial pursuit. Third, behind every bolt lay an economy untouched by shortages, capable of repeating perfection thousands of times. The data sheets left Rechlin stamped Geheime Kommandosache, top secret. Yet even secrecy could not contain their implications. Tactical officers, designers and strategists all drew the same inference. Future German fighters would need radical new answers, jet propulsion, pressurized cockpits, new alloys to restore parity. And as those projects began, attention turned to the Thunderbolt's other mysteries, its guns, its range, and the invisible supply chain that powered it across an ocean. Angle D, armament and firepower. The next evaluation turned to the wings. Technicians removed the leading-edge panels to expose 8 heavy Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, aligned in precise symmetry, 4 per side. Ammunition boxes fed each through chutes that curved gracefully into the breeches, every link inspected by armorers trained for mass interchangeability. German engineers examined the belts, disintegrating links, mixed armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, and noted the sheer volume, over 3,400 cartridges in total. The Luftwaffe had long debated the trade-off between cannon and machine gun. The MG-151-20 and Mk-108 delivered devastating hits with fewer rounds, but their slower rate of fire and lower muzzle velocity demanded close range. The Thunderbolt reversed that equation. Its synchronized 50s fired nearly 100 rounds per second combined, forming a dense, stable pattern effective at 400 meters or more. Ballistic tests at Rechlin proved that this convergence could rip apart a Bf-109's wing before it even entered cannon range. One report summarized the discovery in technical understatement: Feuerdichte außergewöhnlich hoch, fire density exceptionally high. For German fighter designers, it was a reminder that aerial lethality did not depend on caliber alone, but on controllable recoil, harmonization, and the pilot's ability to keep the sight steady. The Thunderbolt's heavy weight made it a perfect gun platform, barely shifting when the weapons fired. To match it, the Luftwaffe began experimenting with multiple 13mm MG-131s and heavier wing structures. But resource limits doomed those upgrades to small numbers. The psychological contrast proved sharper still. American pilots, confident in 8 guns and armor, pressed attacks through head-on merges that German pilots often avoided. Every burst carried the sound of a doctrine born from industrial abundance: volume, not finesse, angle E, fuel, logistics. And range. If the turbo-supercharger symbolized technological advantage, the Thunderbolt's reach embodied logistical might. Engineers measured the internal tanks and detachable belly fuel cells, then compared them to their own fighter layouts. The numbers were startling. With 305 gallons internal and external stores extending to 405, a P-47 could now escort bombers deep into Germany. By early 1944, the addition of drop tanks allowed jugs from England to reach Berlin, loiter, and return. In the Luftwaffe's design offices, such range seemed almost mythical. Even the long-legged Bf-109G6 carried barely 100 gallons and required precise throttle management to cross France. German aviation fuel shortages compounded the problem. Every sortie demanded calculations to the liter. The Americans burned fuel by the ton, confident another convoy would replenish them. The inspection team at Rechlin noted the Thunderbolt's fuel system's redundancy. multiple pumps, automatic cut-off valves, self-sealing lines. These refinements revealed a philosophy where reliability outweighed all else. For American planners, range was not just an engineering metric. It was a strategy. The P-47's extension of bomber escort radius forced the Luftwaffe to defend every inch of its homeland simultaneously, fracturing already exhausted squadrons. An internal memorandum circulated among Reich Air Ministry analysts captured the realization succinctly. Der Feind kämpft mit Entfernung. Wir mit Nähe. The enemy fights with distance. We fight with proximity. From that insight grew a grim acceptance. The Reich could innovate, but it could not outproduce. Its engineers could copy blueprints, but not the fuel refineries or assembly plants behind them. The Thunderbolt, more than any single airframe, personified that imbalance. Angle F, training and psychological impact. By late 1943, Circus Rosarius began using the captured P-47 for demonstration flights across occupied Europe. Crews painted it with bold yellow stripes to prevent friendly fire and hauled it to various airfields, where assembled fighter squadrons watched the giant American planes start, taxi, and take off under German control. The presentations were intended to educate, but they also produced unintended awe. Pilots gathered around the machine after each landing, tracing its armor with their hands, inspecting bullet scars sealed by factory patches. The message was clear. The enemy's aircraft could endure what theirs could not. Reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 and JG-54 reveal mixed emotions, technical curiosity blended with quiet dread. In their logbooks, some airmen recorded encountering thunderbolts that seemed immune to damage, describing them as fliegende Festungen, flying fortresses, a term previously reserved for bombers. At the Luftwaffe's flight schools, instructors incorporated Thunderbolt characteristics into tactical lectures. Rechlin distributed silhouette charts, warning trainees never to mistake its broad wings for a twin-engine type. Combat simulations emphasized avoiding low-altitude turning fights and focusing on ambush dives from high-energy states. Knowledge of the enemy was thorough, but morale remained brittle. Every visit by the captured Jug reminded its viewers of the widening gulf in production and endurance. Its polished aluminum skin, its confident roar, the ease with which it lifted from rough airfields, all contrasted painfully with Germany's dwindling supplies and patched-up fighters. A report from early 1944 described one observer's reaction in almost poetic terms. Dieses Flugzeug riecht nach Öl und Überlegenheit. This aircraft smells of oil and superiority. Thus the Thunderbolt became more than an object of study. It became a symbol. Within its alloy ribs and roaring cylinders, the Luftwaffe saw both the future of air warfare and the approaching end of its own. By the close of these technical and psychological studies, the verdict was unanimous. The Thunderbolt embodied an industrial civilization geared for global war, combining brute force, endurance, and engineering foresight. For the Reich's scientists and pilots, understanding it meant confronting a truth that equations alone could not conceal. The enemy's sky was getting larger, louder, and inexorably closer. And as those yellow-banded Jugs appeared in increasing numbers over the Ruhr and Berlin, the Luftwaffe's analysts turned from theory to survival. They had measured the enemy's strength in horsepower and steel. Now they would face it in combat. By early 1944, the lessons from Rechlin were no longer confined to laboratories. They roared overhead every morning in the contrails of the 8th Air Force. The Americans had solved their greatest weakness, range. New paper-lined drop tanks and field-modified plumbing extended the P-47's reach hundreds of miles. From airfields at Debden, Halesworth and Bodney, the Jugs now crossed the Channel not to fight at the frontier, but to escort deep into the German heartland. They arrived before the bombers and stayed after them. For the first time, the Luftwaffe's interceptors met opposition from takeoff to landing. What the engineers had admired in theory, altitude power, Dive speed, survivability, now unfolded in 3 dimensions above the Ruhr, at 25,000 feet. Formations of P-47s waited in stacked tiers, using radio vectors from radar controllers in England. When German radar spotted incoming bombers, Jagdgeschwader units scrambled into a sky already thick with enemy fighters. The moment the 109s began climbing, Thunderbolts pounced from higher altitude, diving through cloud banks with guns blazing. Many Luftwaffe pilots never reached the bomber stream at all. The first large-scale proof came on January 11th, 1944, during the second attack on Oschersleben and Halberstadt. Rough weather had scattered American formations, and the Luftwaffe expected an easy harvest. Instead, dozens of P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group and 353rd Group appeared over central Germany. In furious dogfights, the Thunderbolts destroyed more than 30 interceptors for the loss of 11 of their own. Post-battle German reports spoke of opponents that dived like meteors and absorbed cannon shells. Without visible effect, the captured aircraft data sheets that had circulated months earlier now returned as lived experience. Inside German command posts, disbelief gave way to grim calculation. Even successful interceptions cost irreplaceable pilots. The ratio of losses could not be sustained. The Reich Air Defense Command began reconsidering strategy, pulling fighter units back from the Channel coast, concentrating them around central production centers. It was a retreat of both territory and morale. As winter turned to spring, the Thunderbolt's new role expanded again. Republic engineers had strengthened the wings for bomb racks, turning the fighter into a JBO, Jagdbomber, for the Americans. The Luftwaffe coined the same word in dread. On bright March mornings, Jugs thundered low across rail lines, dropping 500-pound bombs on locomotives, then climbing to strafe the wreckage with 8 guns. German locomotives burned. Road convoys scattered into ditches. The weapon that had once escorted bombers now created its own miniature air war over every road and siding. Combat footage reviewed by Allied intelligence later confirmed what German observers recorded in diaries. The Thunderbolt's dive recovery allowed devastating hit-and-run strikes. Ground crews at Luftwaffe bases patched holes daily, knowing the next raid might finish the job. Even hardened anti-aircraft gunners noted the psychological difference. P-47s did not break off easily. They came back in pairs and fours, trading altitude for precision, diving vertically through flak bursts, trusting their armor to bring them out alive. Every engagement amplified what the Rechlin engineers had written in sterile reports. Strength meant endurance. The Bf-109 and FW-190 could still outturn the Jug in a brief, perfect duel, but no pilot could guarantee such conditions anymore. The skies had become a contest of stamina, fuel, structure, nerve. In April 1944, the big week offensives struck the Reich's aircraft industry itself. Hundreds of Thunderbolts escorted bombers to Leipzig, Gotha and Regensburg, pounding the factories that produced the very engines once dissecting their captured kin. Within 5 days, key assembly lines lay in ruins. Replacement output fell by half. Pilots returning from those missions recalled the eerie symmetry. The enemy's analysts had studied a single captured Thunderbolt. Now entire swarms repaid the examination with high explosive lessons of their own. At Rechlin, the technicians who had once leaned over the open cowling of the captured Jug listened to the raids from air raid shelters. They recognized the engine note instantly, the deep-throated roar of the R-2800, turbocharged by the same machinery they had catalogued bolt by bolt. One engineer later wrote, "It was as if our laboratory had come to life above us." By summer, Germany's defensive map looked like a closing fist around its own heart. Interceptor losses exceeded production. Fuel depots ran dry. The Luftwaffe introduced emergency types, the Bf-109K, the FW-190D9, and the first Me-262 jets, but these arrived in handfuls. The P-47, meanwhile, evolved again into the bubble canopy P-47D-25, offering pilots unobstructed vision and still greater firepower. The mechanical giant once mocked for weight now symbolized survivability. The turning point was complete, but not yet recognized. German high command still believed technology could yield a miracle. Jet propulsion, rocket weapons, new tactics, but the frontline pilots knew otherwise. Every mission drained reserves that could not be replaced. The sky belonged to the heavier machine and the Reich's engineers, who had once disassembled a Thunderbolt for answers, now confronted their own disassembly from the air. The war in the air had entered its irreversible phase, yet its full consequences, industrial collapse, the moral reckoning within the Luftwaffe, and the post-war legacy of what those engineers learned were still to unfold. By mid-1944, the Reich's air defense fought not for victory but for delay. The Thunderbolt now appeared everywhere, above Normandy's beaches, over the forests of the Ardennes, deep inside Bavaria. What began as a test curiosity had become the most familiar sound of defeat. The heavy, metallic growl of an R-2800 throttling low across the treetops. In June, when the Allies landed in France, the P-47's transformation reached its peak. Entire fighter groups operated from hastily built airstrips only days behind the front. The same traits that had impressed the engineers at Rechlin, ruggedness, redundant systems, power in low gear, made the Thunderbolt ideal for close air support. It shrugged off dust, shell splinters, and rough takeoffs that would cripple a lighter airframe. Crews called it the Jug with affection. German soldiers at the front gave it another name, the butcher bird of the Allies. On the Eastern Front, Luftwaffe intelligence officers compared reports from their Western counterparts and realized that the same pattern repeated wherever the Americans fought: methodical, material, relentless. The Thunderbolt was not a pilot's aircraft. It was an army's aircraft. It built to serve a doctrine of total logistics. At the factories that still operated, engineers revisited their earlier notes on the captured P-47, searching for anything that might yield a countermeasure. They considered simplified turbo systems, heavier armor for the FW-190, and experimental high-octane fuel blends. None reached mass production. The raw materials for turbo blades, nickel, cobalt, chrome, were now strategic fantasies. Allied bombers had erased the smelters that produced them. A war fought on altitude and endurance had reduced the Luftwaffe to a defensive reflex. The Americans, by contrast, turned the Thunderbolt into a flying artillery platform. A single squadron could cut an armored column to pieces in minutes. Reports from the Normandy breakout record Thunderbolts destroying hundreds of vehicles in a day, using rockets and bombs guided only by skill and numbers. Pilots often returned with windshields streaked with oil and dust, refueled, rearmed, and took off again within 15 minutes. Such operational tempo astonished German observers captured later. It was the final proof of what the Rechlin engineers had sensed. Technology mattered, but organization decided. Through the summer of 1944, German fighter units disintegrated under the strain. Fuel training hours dropped from 40 to 12 per pilot. Sorties were limited to intercepts only when bombers crossed specific grid lines. Meanwhile, the P-47 groups flew 5-6 times a day. Luftwaffe controllers began referring to the Thunderbolt by code. R-22 sighted, dive immediately. To engage was to risk annihilation. Many attacks were abandoned without contact. The human cost grew unbearable. Juggeschwader 26, once the pride of the Channel Defense, lost 3/4 of its pilots between March and August. Replacement flyers, boys of 19, entered combat after barely 10 hours on type. Against them came men with 2 years' experience, armored cockpits, and engines that never quit. German radio intercepts captured their frustration. They fall on us from the sun. We cannot outdive. We cannot outclimb. By autumn, the captured Thunderbolt stored in Rechlin's hangar stood neglected, dust collecting on its wings. Its disassembled panels, once objects of study, had become relics of a world that no longer existed. A few surviving engineers were ordered to focus on the jet programs, the Me-262 and He-162, projects promising salvation through speed rather than strength. Yet even these prototypes carried echoes of what they had learned from the Jug: robust landing gear, redundant systems, protection for the pilot. The American machine had reshaped their design instincts even as it destroyed their factories. In November 1944, a final irony played out above the collapsing front. During an Allied attack on the Lechfeld airfield complex, several Thunderbolts strafed a line of parked Me-262 jet prototypes, the very aircraft meant to restore German superiority. Witnesses described the scene with bitter precision: the old, propeller-driven fighter annihilating the future before it could take off. When the war turned to defense of the homeland in early 1945, German anti-aircraft units reported Thunderbolts bombing rail yards in Berlin's suburbs, escorted by Mustangs and Lightnings. No one spoke anymore of technical comparison. It was pure endurance. The Luftwaffe's pilots still fought bravely, but each sortie felt like a final gesture against inevitability. The engineer's early phrase, technisch überlegen aber zu schwer, had inverted itself. The Thunderbolt's heaviness was its triumph. The Reich's lightness, its death sentence. In the war's final weeks, as American columns advanced through Bavaria, captured documents from Rechlin fell into Allied hands. Among them were the original inspection notes from 1943, the first day they had opened the Thunderbolt's engine bay. Allied intelligence officers smiled, reading the German marginalia: admiration, disbelief, envy. They saw confirmation of what their own pilots had long known, that the Thunderbolt's design was not simply clever, but inevitable in a nation that could build without fear of running out of steel, fuel, or time. On May 8, 1945, when the guns finally fell silent, a few of those German engineers were taken into Allied custody. Questioned about the captured aircraft, one of them reportedly shrugged and said, "Wir wussten, dass wir verloren hatten, als wir es fliegen sahen. We knew we had lost when we saw it fly." The turning point, in truth, had not been a single battle or factory raid. It had occurred 2 years earlier, on that fog-cold morning when the first P-47 started its engine at Rechlin and shook the hangar walls. In that thunder of mechanical certainty lay the sound of a future Germany could not match. When the dust settled over Europe in May 1945, the sound of the Thunderbolt's radial engines faded into silence, replaced by the quiet hum of occupying trucks. For the first time in 6 years, the skies above Germany were empty. The Luftwaffe existed only on paper. Hangars that once housed the Reich's proudest fighters now contained twisted wreckage or surrendered aircraft, waiting for Allied inspection. Among them were the remains of the captured P-47 Thunderbolt, its fuselage scorched by stray incendiaries, its data plates pried off by souvenir hunters. What had once been a technological marvel now sat as scrap metal, yet the memory of its presence lingered among the engineers who had touched it. For them, the aircraft had been more than an enemy. It had been a revelation. In the war's final reports, the Luftwaffe's own analysts offered rare candor. They wrote that Germany's defeat in the air was not due to courage or tactics, but to industrial imbalance. The Thunderbolt stood as the embodiment of that truth. It represented a nation that could mass-produce excellence and maintain it across oceans. American factories built nearly 15,700 of them, each one nearly identical, each rolling from the line with precision impossible under bombardment. German production of high-performance fighters never reached a quarter of that figure. Post-war interrogations of German design officers revealed a consistent theme: admiration mixed with resignation. Many admitted that the P-47's turbo-supercharger and cooling systems were a generation ahead. They spoke of the alloys they could never obtain, the precision tools they could never replace, the fuel quality they could never match. One engineer from Daimler-Benz summarized it simply: they built power into the sky. We built power into the pilot. It was an honest epitaph for two divergent philosophies of war. In operational terms, the consequences were devastating. Between January and May 1944, German fighter losses in defense of the Reich exceeded 200 aircraft, a pace no replacement program could sustain. Training units collapsed as aviation gasoline ran out. The once elite Jagdgeschwader became shadows of their former selves, surviving on captured French and synthetic fuels that degraded engines after hours of flight. Meanwhile, Allied P-47s and P-51s flew on. 100-octane gasoline refined in safety across the Atlantic. The numerical imbalance widened further when the Thunderbolt's ground attack version entered full service. By late 1944, 9 groups operated in continental Europe, destroying more than 80,000 rail cars and vehicles in 5 months. German attempts to counter them with flak and night fighters failed. The low-flying jugs appeared at dawn, vanished at dusk, and returned the next day. Frontline commanders began referring to daylight simply as Thunderbolt time. For the Reich scientific community, the aftermath carried humiliation but also reluctant learning. Allied technical intelligence teams invited, or compelled, German engineers to explain their findings from captured Allied machines. In the rubble of Rechlin, stacks of reports on the Thunderbolt's turbo system were discovered intact. They became valuable references for post-war research into high-altitude propulsion. Ironically, those same men who had once tested the jug now helped the Allies understand why it had worked so well. Several were later recruited under Operation Paperclip and its British equivalents, working on jet turbine metallurgy and high-temperature alloys. Among them circulated an unspoken consensus. The future of flight belonged to those who could merge engineering imagination with industrial capacity. The Thunderbolt had proven the concept. For ordinary Germans, the aftermath was simpler. They remembered the deep growl that came before the bombs, the endless daytime presence of silver fighters circling in formation. Farmers ploughing fields found fragments of .50 caliber shells embedded in soil. Children played with the aluminum shards that once formed its wings. To them, the Thunderbolt was not a machine, but an omen, the sound that preceded surrender. Inside the Allied camps, the tone was different. Pilots who had flown the jug from England to Bavaria saw in its battered fuselage a symbol of endurance. They knew its faults, sluggish climb, heavy controls, but they also knew it had brought them home again and again. Many of those men would go on to fly jets, yet they would speak of the Thunderbolt with reverence, as if it were a living companion, forged in noise and fire. In Germany's laboratories, the lessons of that captured aircraft did not die. They were carried into the new age, the jet age, where engineers would chase the same goals under different flags: reliability, strength, and altitude. The Thunderbolt's influence lingered quietly in their blueprints, even as the world moved on. The war was over, but the dialogue between machine and maker had only begun. The next step was to understand how those lessons shaped both the victors' and the defeated's view of power, progress, and the cost of modern war. The ruins of the Reich became classrooms. In the hangars of Farnborough, Wright Field, and Le Bourget, Allied technicians lined up the remnants of Germany's aircraft alongside captured American and British types. There, in the bright summer of 1945, engineers from every former front crawled beneath fuselages and debated what the war had proven. The Thunderbolt was present among them, one example freshly flown in from a European airbase, its olive paint dulled by years of service, its propeller tips still yellow with dust from France. For the British and Americans, the P-47 had validated a doctrine: industrial quantity could generate its own form of quality. Precision through repetition, not craftsmanship alone. Each bolt, each wire harness, each gauge was identical, allowing crews to swap parts from wrecks to restore others within hours. German specialists observing this process admitted that such standardization had been the Allies' secret weapon, one as decisive as radar or the atom bomb. In the debriefing rooms, conversations often drifted toward philosophy. Could Germany have built something similar? The answer was always the same: not under siege. A turbo-supercharger required nickel, heat-resistant steels, and machining tolerance within 1/1000th of an inch. Allied bombers had erased the smelters capable of such work. A single nation cannot build a high-altitude fighter while hiding in tunnels. Yet even in defeat, the German engineers took notes. They examined the Thunderbolt's pressure controls, its duct geometry, its cowl flap linkages. These details, faithfully logged in new Allied research files, influenced the post-war generation of aircraft across both sides of the Iron Curtain. When Soviet designers studied American Lend-Lease fighters, they too noticed the lesson of the jug: power, reliability, survivability. 3 pillars of a modern air force. Within a decade, the lineage could be traced from the Thunderbolt's radial brute force to jet fighters built on the same philosophy of toughness and standardization. In occupied Germany, surviving Luftwaffe pilots returned to civilian life. Some became engineers again, others storytellers. They remembered the captured P-47 with a mixture of fear and respect. In interviews conducted during the 1950s, they still spoke of its sound, the low, throbbing thunder that rolled across valleys before a strike. "You could tell it was a thunderbolt," one said, "because the earth shook before the bombs fell." For them, that vibration remained the heartbeat of a war they could never win. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Republic aviation transformed the Thunderbolt's heritage into jet form. The F-84 Thunderjet and later F-105 Thunderchief carried its name, its massive presence, and its reputation for durability. In Korea and Vietnam, American pilots once again flew descendants of the same design philosophy: heavy, fast-diving, and nearly indestructible. The machine that German engineers had once called überkonstruiert, overbuilt, had become the global standard for combat resilience. Historians would later see irony in this continuity. The P-47 had been born from interwar fears that airframes could never be strong enough. By war's end, its weight had become wisdom. Jet aircraft could now fly faster and higher, but the basic truth remained: the pilot's survival depended on structure, redundancy, and forgiving design. Those were the qualities Rechlin's inspectors had underlined in 1943, never realizing they were describing the blueprint of aviation's future. For post-war Germany, that legacy shaped a different kind of rebirth. When the Federal Republic eventually rebuilt its air arm under NATO, its trainers and fighters reflected lessons once learned in secrecy. The emphasis on maintenance, standardized parts, and safety procedures owed more to the Thunderbolt's logic than to any wartime ideology. Its ghost lingered in every checklist. As the decades passed, the original captured P-47 disappeared, most likely scrapped during the chaotic demilitarization of 1946. Only fragments survived: a piece of fuselage armor in a museum, a data plate preserved in a private collection. Yet its story endured through the documents it inspired. The engineers who had once dismantled it never forgot what they saw inside: the tangled beauty of function-serving power, the realization that technology is as much a social achievement as a mechanical one. By the 1960s, when a new generation of German and American engineers collaborated on jetliners and NATO fighters, few remembered the dusty hangar at Rechlin, but the principles discovered there, robust design, altitude endurance, pilot protection, had become global standards. The Thunderbolt's thunder had long since faded, yet its echo shaped every aircraft that followed. The war had ended in ruins, but within those ruins lay a message that outlasted ideology. Machines revealed the civilizations that built them. The P-47 Thunderbolt had shown Germany its own limits, and the world its coming future. The story of the captured Thunderbolt is not simply about a machine. It is about a moment in history when two visions of modern war collided: craftsmanship against mass production, precision against abundance, ingenuity against endurance. On a cold airfield in 1943, German engineers stared into the open heart of an aircraft that defied everything they believed about how fighters should be built. What they saw inside was not arrogance. It was confidence, the confidence of a nation that could afford to think in thousands, not dozens. In the years that followed, that realization spread beyond war. It reminded the world that technology is never neutral. Every bolt, every gauge, every turbine blade carries the imprint of the society that forged it. The P-47 Thunderbolt was heavy, loud, and unapologetically practical. It was built not for elegance but for survival, and so were the men who flew it. For the Luftwaffe engineers at Rechlin, the lesson came too late. They learned that innovation without resources becomes a kind of art without canvas. Their notes, preserved through surrender and occupation, spoke less of envy than of respect. They had measured the enemy's power and found in it the reflection of a future they could not reach. Today, the few remaining Thunderbolts that still fly do so in peacetime skies, their engines echoing across fields once scorched by war. Each roar is a memory of courage, of industry, of the moment when metal and mind defined destiny. The aircraft that once symbolized overwhelming force now serves as a relic of restraint, a reminder of what happens when nations wager their genius on destruction. In the end, the captured Thunderbolt taught more than aerodynamics. It taught humility, the realization that progress is never just mechanical, and that the greatest victories belong not to the machines that fly, but to the societies capable of building peace after they land. If you enjoyed this story of power and precision, don't stop here. Click on the next video in our Weapons That Shocked the Reich series and witness how another Allied design left German commanders speechless. Subscribe, share, and keep history alive.